I used to just write songs, I still do. I just write a song and it just comes out however it wants to. And some of them are catchy songs, like Here Comes the Sun, and some of them aren't, but to me there's just songs and I just write them, and some will be considered as good by maybe the masses and some won't, but to me they're just songs, things that are there that have to be got out. I usually get like the first few lines of lyrics and melody both at once, and then I finish the melody usually first and then have to write the words. Now I need to write a couple more verses and I find it much more difficult. But John gave me a handy tip once, which is once you start to write a song, try and finish it straight away while you're in the mood. And I've learned from experience, because you go back to it and then you're in a whole different state of mind and it's more difficult. Sometimes it's easier, but on the whole it's more difficult to come back to something. So I do now try and finish them straight away.
When the White Album was released in November of '68, George's songs were generally seen as less significant than John and Paul's. Up until 1966, his compositions were given little attention by producer George Martin and the band. In 1967 and early '68, he wrote 5 songs, but only 3 were released, mostly featuring Indian instrumentation. Unfortunately, this era may have been what John referred to when he said, "There was an embarrassing period where George's songs weren't that good, and nobody wanted to say anything, but we all worked on them." Things changed in the Beatles' final year and a half, though no one expected it. When While My Guitar Gently Weeps appeared, many likely assumed it was another Lennon-McCartney song. Over time, though, the public recognized it as a legitimately great track from George, helped by its release as the B-side to Obla Di Obla Da in some countries. By 1973, it was one of just 3 White Album tracks included on the Beatles' Blue compilation album. Paul related his surprise about George's development as a songwriter. "From the little guy I met on the bus, a little guy with a little quiff in, his hair, a little guitar player. He became a very wise man. So when I use the word magical, that's what I mean. That didn't have to happen. We could have had 5 years and gone back to the factory. No groups were supposed to last more than 5 years." George himself humbly admitted, "I knew the song was pretty good." George once said he wrote the song at my mother's home in Warrington, in the north of England, the spiritual home of George Formby. The house, called Sevenoaks, was in the village of Appleton Thorne, Warrington. He bought it in '65 so his parents could move out of Liverpool once Beatlemania made life there unbearable. It seems he visited them after returning from India with the Beatles, and during that trip in April or May 1968, he wrote most of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. While in India, Donovan taught John a finger-picking guitar style that John later used on songs like Dear Prudence and Julia. It seems George picked up on it too, as you can hear in the early acoustic take of While My Guitar Gently Weeps from July 1968. As for the lyrics, George explained, "I had a copy of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. In the West we think of coincidence as being something that just happens. It just happens that I'm sitting here and the wind is blowing in my hair and so on. But the Eastern concept is that whatever happens is all meant to be, and that there's no such thing as coincidence. Every little item that's going down has a purpose." The idea was in my head when I visited my parents' home in the north of England. I decided to write a song based on the first thing I saw upon opening any book, as it would be relative to that moment, at that time. I picked up a book at random, opened it, and saw Gently Weeps, then laid the book down again and started the song. Some of the words to the song were changed before I finally recorded it. While My Guitar Gently Weeps was just a simple study based on the theory that everything has some purpose for being there at that given moment. So I opened this book and I saw Gently Weeps. I shut the book and then I started the tune. According to Rolling Stone, the book George grabbed that day may have contained Coates Kinney's 1849 poem, Rain on the Roof, which includes the lines, "And the melancholy darkness gently weeps in rainy tears." By May 28, George had most of the lyrics in place, though some changes followed. Initially, the third line of the first verse was, "Problems you sow are the troubles you're reaping," which he soon dropped. The final verse was originally, "I look at the trouble and hate that is raging, and I'm sitting here doing nothing but aging," along with other changes. The most telling line of the whole song, one that even the most casual of listeners could easily catch, was, "With every mistake we must surely be learning." With the political turmoil that was abundant at the time, the sarcastic but poignant lyric stands out as unmistakable testimony to the plight of mankind's existence. The Beatles began recording the White Album at EMI Studios on May 30th, but George didn't get a chance to work on one of his songs until July 25th. "I always had to do about 10 of Paul and John's songs before they'd give me the break," he once said. After patiently sitting through countless takes of his bandmates' songs, especially the long sessions for Obla Di, Obla Da, George finally introduced While My Guitar Gently Weeps as the first of 5 songs he hoped to include on the album. Many believe the first, bareback takes would have worked just fine, as Brian Gibson recalls. The song changed considerably by the time they had finished with it. They completed the song on 8-track tape at a later date, and this gave them the immediate temptation to put more and more stuff on. I personally think it was best left uncluttered. George must have felt the song needed a full band arrangement, so the Beatles spent the session rehearsing multiple takes, all recorded for George to review at home. The session ran late, stretching until 3:15 a.m. the next morning. George had to be even more patient before the Beatles returned to While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The next focus was Paul's Hey Jude, which took up their time until mid-August. Instead of pushing ahead with Gently Weeps, George introduced another song, the ill-fated Not Guilty, on August 7th. A full 3 weeks after the group first worked on the track, they turned their attention to it again on August 16th. They entered the studio sometime after 7 p.m. to record a full band version of the song, George deciding during the past 3 weeks that the acoustic version he previously recorded wasn't what he had envisioned for the song after all. From this point on, that beautiful acoustic rendition was considered just another demo recording. They recorded 14 takes of the rhythm track, with Paul on bass, George on guitar, John on organ, and Ringo on drums. During these takes, George remarked, "I like the way it suddenly changes into a song," showing how he liked the full band arrangement better. Take 14 was the keeper. Interestingly, while the recording sheet listed George Martin as the producer for the session, one of the tape boxes was clearly labeled, "The Beatles, produced by the Beatles." Brian Gibson remembers, "The White Album was a time when George Martin was trying to relinquish control over the group. There were a number of occasions, holidays and when he had other recording commitments, when he wasn't available for sessions, and they would just get on and produce it themselves. He certainly wasn't around for quite a considerable period of time, although they'd always fall back on him for scoring and arranging things." Dave Harries remembers, "The studios were never allowed to use any equipment until Francis Thompson had said it was up to standard, which was great, fine. But when you've got 4 innovative lads from Liverpool who want to make better recordings, and they've got the smell of the machine, matters can take a different course." They must have been getting on to engineer Ken Scott about it, because Ken Townsend called me up and suggested we get one of the machines out of Francis Thompson's office and take it along to EMI Studio No. 2. I very nearly got the sack over that. Engineer Ken Townsend adds, "The 8-track machines were not suitable at that stage for pop recordings. The Beatles had become reliant on the use of automatic double tracking and phasing, so before the 3M machines were pressed into service, extensive modifications, particularly in the head block, were designed and implemented by Francis Thompson at the studios." Testimony for putting a new 8-track machine to use before it was really ready is given by engineer Mike Shady. Unless the tape operator remembered to mute the output from the machine when you spooled back and wanted to hear the tape traveling past the heads, it would send the spooling noise straight into the Beatles' headphones, almost blasting their heads off. They got very uptight about that, understandably, because it can be very disconcerting. Brian Gibson continues, George particularly wanted to get the sound of a crying guitar, but he didn't want to use a wah-wah tone pedal, so he was experimenting with a backwards guitar solo. This meant a lot of time-consuming shuttling back and forth from the studio to the control room. We spent a long night trying to get it to work, but in the end the whole thing was scrapped. George, remembering the backward guitar effect that works so well on I'm Only Sleeping, thought this would work well to spruce up While My Guitar Gently Weeps. But as George describes the mood of these sessions, we tried to record it, but Paul and John were so used to just cranking out their tunes that it was very difficult at times to get serious and record one of mine. It wasn't happening. They weren't taking it seriously. And so I went home that night thinking, well, that's a shame, because I knew the song was pretty good. Because the Beatles now had 8 tracks at their disposal instead of 4, the tendency was to keep adding more overdubs than needed, thereby overproducing the song until it sounded somewhat muddy. Gibson describes an occurrence with a particular Beatles song, which could easily have been this one. There was one song, I can't remember the title, in which they'd added so many instruments that you just couldn't hear the drums anymore. So they overdubbed Ringo playing a chair, a red plastic Abbey Road chair, slapping the drumsticks on the cushion and making a thwack to emphasize the snare beat, because they'd buried it. In any event, the song at this point is described by Mark Lewison as quite different from the released version, with less prominent Harrison vocals and the backwards guitar and organ parts to the fore. George had listened to a playback of the song at this point and didn't like what he'd heard, deciding to scrap the whole thing and start fresh. I'm sure that most Beatles fans would love to hear this version one day, since it has never surfaced on any bootlegs or official releases. In an understandably frustrated mood, George took the group through 28 more takes. However, sometime during the recording of this remake of the song, a special guest entered the studio. George explains, I was driving into London with Eric Clapton, and I said, "What are you doing today? Why don't you come to the studio and play on this song for me?" He said, "Oh no, I can't do that. Nobody's ever played on a Beatles record, and the others wouldn't like it." I said, "Look, it's my song, and I'd like you to play on it." Clapton, who had recently announced his decision to dissolve his band Cream and was gearing up for a farewell tour in the autumn of that year, was, in fact, giving George a lift to EMI Studios in London from Surrey, where they both lived. They'd known each other since the days when Eric played with the Yardbirds, and had shared the bill with the Beatles during their series of Christmas shows in late '64 and early '65. Eric apparently dropped George off and reluctantly agreed to arrive sometime later to lend a hand in recording George's song. So he came in, George says. I said, "Eric's going to play on this one." And it was good because that made everyone act better. It's interesting to see how nicely people behave when you bring a guest in, because they don't really want everybody to know that they're so bitchy. Paul got on the piano and played a nice intro, and they all took it more seriously. Also, it left me free to just play the rhythm and do the vocal. There was a similar situation when Billy Preston came later to play on Let It Be, and everybody was arguing. Just bringing a stranger in amongst us made everyone cool out. I admired Eric as a guitar player, and I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul McCartney. He ruined me as a guitar player. I rated Eric Clapton as a guitar player, and he treated me like a human. I'd been through this sitar thing. I'd played sitar for 3 years, and I had just listened to classical Indian music and practiced sitar, except for when we played dates, studio dates, and then I'd get out the guitar and just play, learn a part and play for the record. But I had really lost a lot of interest in the guitar. Paul, in turn, said, "It was very generous to give Eric this moment when he could have had it for himself." George was very like that. He was very open. Brian Gibson described Eric Clapton's work in the studio on this day. Eric Clapton behaved just like any session musician. Very quiet, just got on and played. That was it. There were no theatrics involved. I remember Eric telling George that Cream's approach to recording would be to rehearse, spending very little time in the studio itself, whereas the Beatles' approach seemed to be record, and eventually get the right one. The sessions were their rehearsals. By 3:45 a.m., This monumental recording session by the Beatles and Eric Clapton, which was once again producerless, was finally complete.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Most listeners assumed it was George playing guitar on the track. George related, "Some people wrote letters to me saying, 'You've got a really good blues feel in the way that you play that guitar.'" We did not publicize Eric's playing really, but we also did not try and conceal it. Eric is a good friend of mine, and I really dig him as a guitarist and as a guy. We used to hang out so much at that period, and Eric gave me a fantastic Les Paul guitar, which is the one that he plays on that date. So it worked out well. This was the classic red 1957 Gibson Les Paul that Eric had named Lucy.
While My Guitar Gently Weeps is one of George Harrison's most iconic tracks, there are so many interesting facets to this recording, but I think one of the biggest influences on the tone, the sound of this recording is how the verse is in the key of A minor, but the chorus is in the key of A major. That's what we call a parallel modulation. We're moving from the minor version of a key to the major version of the key, and then back again when we get to verse 2. We can see here that the verse is based on this descending chord progression in A minor, where the lowest note, the bass note in the chord, is kind of climbing down. But then when we get to the chorus, we go to an A major chord instead. And what this has the effect of doing is sounding really bright. It sounds almost like the sun's come out, right? And not only do we get this brilliant moment of brightness when we hit the A major chord, but because we're now in A major for the chorus, when we return to the next verse in A minor, we're going to get that swell of darkness again. So we get these two kind of dramatic emotional moments in the tonality.
Beatles fans around the world had been impressed with George's songwriting skills throughout the 60s. But as of late 68, it appears that George finally had written something that actually impressed him. And indeed, he should have. Even Paul had to acknowledge, he became one of the greats.